Welcome, everybody. My name is Amanda Thomas, and I would love to welcome you to Science on Tap. We are here. I'm very excited for the talk this evening. We are here to talk about the Menopause Manifesto with Dr. Jen Gunter, who, if you have been on Twitter ever and are interested in the women's health issues, you probably know who she is. But if you don't, she is an OBGYN, a pain medicine physician, and an author, most notably of the book, The Vagina Bibles, which are the Vagina Bible. I'm having trouble with my words this evening. Pardon me. But she spoke at a Science on Tap back in, I believe it was July of last year, and it was a really fun event. And this book just came out, I believe, this week on Tuesday. And we're excited to have her here to talk about the Menopause Manifesto. So let's get started. And I want to mention that if you are interested in picking up the book, if you haven't already, please go to broadwaybooks.net. And they are a local bookstore here in Portland, Oregon, where we are based. And you can get a 15% discount with them if you purchase the book through their website on until June 10 and use the code STGunter15. And we have folks who will put that information in the chat if you're watching on Zoom, or if you're watching on Facebook or YouTube, we'll put that in the comments as well. So that'll be available to you. For those of you who are new to Science on Tap, just a quick little bit of information. We are a science entertainment science lecture series that's based in Portland, Oregon, specifically targeting adults. And we are hoping to make science fun and relevant and meaningful for adults in the community. And this is obviously a picture of the before times when we could hold our events in theaters. We have been doing our events online for the past year and change. And if you are interested in seeing any of our past events, including Jen's previous talk on the Vagina Bible, you can check out our YouTube channel at Science on Tap ORWA. We've got a bunch of previous events and also our podcast. You can listen to episodes from that on YouTube as well. So just a few housekeeping things. Actually, just wanted to mention, say a quick thank you to our Patreon supporters. We've got 124 Patreon supporters right now. You are all amazing, and you should all check your email inboxes, because I just sent an email out today talking about some special advance tickets to our upcoming talk on crows that I just posted today. I'll talk about that at the end of the event this evening. But for Patreon folks, you are going to be getting a discount on tickets for that. So check out your email. So with all of that logistical stuff out of the way, I am going to stop sharing my screen and say welcome to Dr. Jen Gunter, who is going to be talking about the Menopause Manifesto. Welcome.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. Hello, everybody from all over. It's lovely to be here again. This is my second time back, and maybe when it's a third time, we'll be able to do it in person, and there'll be beer involved. So anyway, I'm going to be talking about my new book, and I'm going to give you a little rundown on the Menopause Manifesto, which has been available on Tuesday. So this is day 2 that it's been out, and then I'm a little bit about medical misinformation online, because that's one of the reasons why I wrote this. And, when I started writing the book, it was pre-pandemic, and I had no idea that something like masks would become politicized, or the way the coronavirus and the pandemic became politicized. And so I think now more than ever, it's really important for us to have good information, good quality information about health information online. And so we can all, have better internet hygiene and hopefully appreciate these things. So when the next pandemic comes around, because obviously that's a possibility, we'll be even more prepared. I'm going to share my screen. Oh, before I do, we've been having some internet issues where I am, and that has involved with the connection dropping out. And so if it does, then I will just get back on, and there'll be a blank screen for a period of time.
Recording in progress.
And I think that your hosts will hopefully entertain you while that happens. So let me just see if I can share my screen and get my slides up. So I wrote this book because there was always, I knew all this shame about the vulva and the vagina, but I had really not appreciated how much silence and shame really existed about menopause. Because as an OBGYN, I talk about it all the time. And I know the backstory of menopause, and I know the medical treatments, and I know what needs to be done. But I had no idea how lonely and how uninformed really a lot of people were about it. And so I realized that this was something I really needed to do something about. And as I started the book, I didn't sort of view it as kind of a feminist thing. But as I began writing and sort of delving into the backstory and really listening to what I was hearing from women, I realized that, we were here at this point in time with this sort of absolute culture of misinformation and disinformation and a lack of information about menopause, primarily due to the patriarchy. And so this really became a feminist cry, as well as a medical Bible. So this all started when I was actually on tour for the Vagina Bible. And I wrote the Vagina Bible because of all of the disinformation and shame, and this was actually, these are that were in the intro, the dedication of the Vagina Bible for every woman who's ever been told, usually by some dude, that she's too wet, too dry, too gross, too loose, too tight, too bloody, or too smelly. This book is for you. So the Vagina Bible, I think, really created a space when I was on tour for people to talk about, things and the lies and the misinformation they'd heard about the vagina, and creating a space really seemed to open the door for people to talk about menopause. And every single stop on tour, almost every reporter I talked to, everybody wanted to talk about menopause. I mean, everybody. And they were almost always the same questions. And so I started to think, okay, I really need to tackle this. And I really need to actually appreciate why we're here. And something one woman said to me, and I wish I'd remembered when, but the words stuck in my head, that menopause felt so lonely, and that there was no culture of menopause. And I really realized that people didn't even understand why we had it. Everything has been viewed through this lens of supposedly ovarian failure, which we'll talk about. And, it just really, many women just felt as if they were graduating to societal irrelevance when they lost their periods, when their periods stopped. And so I really wanted to change that with this book. So, many women just don't know what to expect when they are no longer expecting a period. And that's really incredible when you consider that most women will spend 1/3 to 1/2 of their lives in menopause, like almost half their lives, and they don't even really understand why they're there. They may have troublesome symptoms such as menstrual irregularities, hot flushes, sleep disturbance, brain fog, vaginal dryness. But there's also an increased risk of medical conditions such as cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, dementia, osteoporosis, urinary tract infections. So this is something people need to know about medically as well. And the fact that they don't leads them to not getting treatments and to actually having an increased risk of negative outcomes. So I always like to say, imagine if you knew nothing about pregnancy and one day your belly started to grow. Like you knew nothing. You didn't know really what it was. You didn't know what was going to happen after. You didn't know about nausea or vomiting. You didn't know how the fetus was going to come out. You had literally nothing. So then when, something started to move, you'd be like, what is going on with my body? When it came time to go into labor, you'd be like, I'm splitting open. What is happening? That how many women feel about menopause. They literally have no concept, and it's not their fault. The way we have been living our lives has really stacked the odds of knowledge against them, something that we really have to change. And so I really began to think about these gaps in medicine and these gaps in society. And this is actually a screenshot from my TED Talk on menstruation. But the quote holds true for menopause. It shouldn't be an act of feminism to know how your body works. But when you look at how women have been gaslighted, how they've had to struggle to get information, that, it does feel like it's an act of feminism. It feels like you have to take up arms to find out what's happening with your body. So how do women not know what we in medicine know about menopause. I mean, we have this huge communication gap, and that's something that I'm really hoping this book and everything that I'm doing is going to help bridge. So, what is menopause? I think it's a really good way to just start with the basics, because I suspect that a lot of people who are watching might be a little bit, maybe they won't know everything about it. So, what it is simply the end of ovarian function, and there's a lot of connection between the brain and the ovaries, and between many organ systems, because everything is wired to facilitate reproduction. And so, when you end ovarian function, there's also changes in hormones in your brain. And really interestingly, we used to think that those were like passive responses to the end of ovarian failure, or to the end of ovarian function, rather. And now we actually believe that some of those hormonal changes may actually be drivers of some of the symptoms and some of the health implications. The average age of menopause is 51. And the time leading up to menopause is a time of great hormonal chaos. So that's known as the menopause transition, but it's also known as premenopause or perimenopause. And think about the menopause transition as puberty in reverse. Just as you had hormonal chaos when you went from puberty to an adult, you have hormonal chaos when you make the other you cross the rainbow, not cross the rainbow, it's cross the crimson bridge on the other end. And why do people have menopause? Well, what happens is we are born with a finite number of eggs in our ovaries, or oocytes. And each cycle ovulate, we recruit many, many more oocytes than we need. And through a combination of aging and the fact that many get recruited each menstruation, we end up with about 1,000 or so left by the time we're sort of ready for menopause. And at that point, really no more oocytes are capable of ovulating. And it's the oocytes that produce the estradiol, high levels of the estrogen, estradiol and estrone, which are the estrogens that are part of ovarian function. And so without ovulation, we don't have any more estrogen, and then menopause. And that's the final menstrual period, is really menopause. And everything after in medicine we say is postmenopause, but it's totally fine to just say in menopause. And in fact, calling the whole spectrum from the menopause transition onwards menopause is totally fine, because there isn't anything really magic that happens with the last period, except for knowing if you're at risk for pregnancy, and also for how we might manage some irregular bleeding. But apart from, starting hormones, or whether you need, to have, any other treatments for hot flashes or hot flushes, that doesn't matter if you're past your final menstrual period or not. So I think that's a good point for people to know, that you don't have to have your last period to actually get help. Now, menopause is diagnosed in retrospect, because you don't know it's your last period. It's your last period. And that's really frustrating for a lot of people. But I like to reframe that again, going back to puberty. We don't really know you're in puberty until you're in it. And you don't really know that puberty's over until, it's over. You might look back and say, oh, hey, you know what? I haven't grown for the last couple of years, and my skin has kind of settled out. And, if you have periods, you might say, oh, my menstrual periods have kind of sorted out. And so I guess, I'm done with puberty. And same thing for the menopause transition. And I think reframing things as puberty can be very helpful for a lot of people. Now, why do people not have this information? Well, there's zero education about it in the school system. There's zero education about really ovarian and uterine health. So sex education, I put that in quotation marks, is what is taught in some schools, although the quality of it obviously varies. But it's typically about pregnancy prevention, and it's almost always kind of centered around purity culture. We don't teach people, young people, about orgasms and good sex. We teach them about being afraid of sex, and we teach them about pregnancy prevention. Maybe some people are in some areas where they have some quality education, but it's pretty limited. And so almost no menopause. And so if you don't talk about it, if no one ever talks to you about menopause, and everything you see, every image you see in society tells you that old women have no worth, then you're going to fear it. It's going to be the most shameful thing to have an aging woman's body. And, I've sort of made this a habit now of every sort of movie that I see or TV show, and you see, the age of the man versus the age of the woman if they're partnered. And it's so common to see a man who's clearly in his 50s or 60s or even 70s with a 20 or 30-year-old wife. right? And there's all these stories of these gorgeous, Hollywood stars auditioning for shows and being told that they're too old at 32 to play the wife of the 50-year-old, right? So if you see that reflected everywhere, of course, the messaging is negative. The other issue is women are told their symptoms are just part of being a woman or they're not that bad. But we never say to men, oh, erectile dysfunction is just part of being a man, or oh, erectile dysfunction is not really that bad. We don't say those things. And so I think it's really important whenever we're dismissing women's symptoms to say, would we use that terminology for the penis? And the answer is almost always no, we wouldn't. Also, because of communication gaps, many women are scared off of therapies. They're warned about breast cancer. Those risks are maybe overinflated, or they really just don't get the correct information to make the right decision. And also, you can have the greatest physician who is the most engaged and is up to date on everything. But if they're only given 15 minutes, how can they possibly explain the medical therapy, the risks for the rest of your life? Menopause is up to half your life. So, making these decisions can't happen in 15 minutes. I've been talking for maybe almost quite 15 minutes. At this point, this is the end of the visit, right? I mean, it's just not possible to deliver quality care for something like menopause in that amount of time. And we've also given women reasons to be concerned. So there's a lot of conflicting studies, or at least the way the data has been transmitted to the public is conflicting. Guidelines change. And look, those of us in science understand that guidelines change. That just means that we've taken new information and we're adjusting based on that. We're course correcting. And I think we've all seen with the pandemic how the general public doesn't quite maybe get this concept of, shifting information is a good thing. It's a good thing to take in new information. But like we've seen with the changing guidelines with masks, how this has been something that's really caused a lot of distress for people. So it's important for us to understand that when we're communicating about conflicting guidelines or guidelines that change, how that might be perceived. And I have to say, everything that's really happened with the pandemic has really given me cause to think about how I might communicate changing guidelines for patients before I just say, oh, well, that was the old guidelines. These are the new ones, not realizing how much that change might affect people. And so now I'm couching it with, and that's a good thing. As we study things, we learn more. And you want a science, you want your doctor, you want the people caring for your health to take new information and course correct. The other problem is not everybody course corrects. So there's some studies that say the length of time from new information to adoption in medical practice can be up to 15 to 17 years. And I'm not excusing that. That's not okay, but that is unfortunately the reality. So there's a lot of reasons that people need a textbook to have at hand so they can hopefully be up to date, they can challenge their providers, and they can know to sort of ask questions. And that's, these are all the reasons why I wrote the book. Another issue, especially when you're talking about sex, is only 63% of OBGYNs routinely ask about sexual activity, 40% about sexual problems, and less than a third about sexual satisfaction. And so if medicine isn't listening, where do they're going to turn elsewhere? It's surprising to us. And so where do they turn? This is the only created. I think I'm going to stop here because I think it's a good one. Science is stodgy and explaining about, and science can rarely be definitive in the way that snake oil can. And so we also, in addition to all of the problems in medicine, we are up against people who are offering magic wands. They're offering they're offering things that I would want. Gosh, I want a magic pill to make everything go away, but I also know that that's not really going to happen. So, we have to accept that this is the reality of how we communicate information, and how can we work around that. So I want to also talk a little bit about this history of medical misogyny, which I cover really in detail in the book. I spent a couple of chapters about it. And this was part of the whole idea of really trying to invent a culture of menopause, really trying to explain to women, where they came from, what the history is behind all of this. And, I think you have to understand that since the beginning of time, sort of, from the histories of the ancient history of our medicine, ancient Greek and ancient Egyptian medicine, women were considered toxic, biologically speaking. The Greeks thought that women's tissues was overly moist, meaning that each cell had too much fluid in it. We were moisture inferior versions, like literally inferior versions of men. And so how did we get rid of that excess fluid? Part of it was menstruation, right? And women also were too hot. And, if you looked at all the humors, blood was part of the humors, right? So it was blood, black bile, yellow bile, and I think phlegm. And so, we had to get rid of this excess heat with menstruation. And so before menopause, everything was blamed on the uterus, because, if you're inherently damaged and because that's how you were built or evolved or created, then, you blame the thing that's different. You blame the you blame the plumbing. And, this idea that, if you had a pain in your shoulder, well, it was because your uterus was pressing on your shoulder. They believed the uterus wandered the body. If you had a headache, well, your uterus was, pressing on something to hurt your head. And it was all the fault of the uterus. And so that's also why, the ancient Greeks were very obsessed with menstruation, because if you weren't having a regular period, this toxic fluid was building up. And so if you look at the Hippocratic corpus, more than half of the recipes are all, crap to go in the vagina or crap to bring on periods, right? So that's where a lot of that obsession sort of came from. So what happened with menopause? Well, with menopause, that toxic fluid wasn't coming out. So that toxic fluid, you were even worse. You were overly moist, but also you were accumulating all these toxins. And so it's really interesting, after menopause, if you were a 60-year-old man and you had a pain in your right side, well, yeah, it was your liver or your gallbladder or whatever they believed caused right-sided pain of the day. Well, if you were a woman, it was your uterus, right? And that still happened. It was not only it was your uterus, it was your menopausal uterus. And so if you see women as inferior, it's really easy to make medicine fit that order. And so you have to kind of really think about that. This whole idea of when you start thinking about the terms that we use in medicine, like that the ovaries failed. Well, they don't. They stopped functioning. That was part of the plan. But, a lot of the language that's used around women's health is also very negative and has, all these negative connotations, or is really awful. For example, pudendum is from the Latin. The pudendum is the area, of the vulva, between the vulva and the anus, and the Latin root of that is to shame. I mean, hymen is out of marriage. So, you have this terminology that's deeply misogynistic in the actual words that we're using. And that's obviously very problematic and something that really needs to change, but it's really part of the culture. So there's a big myth about menopause that you hear all the time, and that women weren't meant to have it, that through the grace of modern medicine and sanitation, that, women were now be able to live beyond their menopause. And that really ties into the notion again, that women are inherently weak or down, and how could they possibly live that age, that long? And I always find that no one ever says, well, because of the grace of modern sanitation and modern medicine, men are now living long enough to get erectile dysfunction, right? No one ever says that. I've never heard that before. So why are we applying the sort of the gifts of medicine and longevity just to women and not to men? Well, you're doing that if you think that women are inherently inferior, or you haven't be bothered to have a look at the literature. So the ancient Greeks were very accurate with recording the age of menopause. Sort of they recorded between the ages of 40 and 50. So if all the women died before menopause, how are they able to record that? It wouldn't be possible. They wouldn't know that. There's also this myth that everybody died in childbirth. Well, if everybody died in childbirth, how are we here? We actually had to be really good reproducers to evolve, to still be here, because we do know that infant mortality was shockingly high, right? 30 to 50%. So if 1/3 to 1/2 of all babies were going to die, you had to be able to get through 2 or 3 pregnancies to have 1 or 2 surviving children. I look at my own great-great-grandparents, and they had 6 children. 2 died before the age of 1, right? So, so this was very common. So we do know actually that, that that women were living to menopause, long before modern medicine. And it's true, more women died in childbirth than do now, but many survived to menopause. And it's really interesting, bad science is part of the reason people believe that. So a lot of people looked at Roman graves to say that, oh, well, look at all these young women dying 23, 24, 19, 20. Oh my gosh, all women died in childbirth. Well, that's a bad way to look at it, because in Roman times, if a woman died first, then she would get a gravestone. But if her husband died first, she wouldn't. So the graveyards are over by women who died before their husbands. So they're overrepresented with young women. So obviously that's just not a good data set to use. So, again, if you believe women are weak, and you believe that women are toxic, and you believe they're not meant to live beyond their ovaries, then looking for data that backs that up. And so there's really several chapters about that in the book. And again, sort of explaining why that's all false, because one of the most misogynistic things is to erase menopausal women from history, right? I mean, to say that, you don't even rate a footnote. And the reason why that's so offensive is that menopause exists for a reason. It's biologically useful. And I know that, every single thing we have has some kind of biologic use, or it had, and we just haven't been living long enough to evolve past it. So the theory of menopause is based on the grandmother hypothesis, and that everybody has looked at menopause as, again, this sign of ovarian failure, these negative terms. And again, if your worldview about women is that they are weak, then those terminologies feel right to you. But the real question isn't, why are ovaries weak and why do they fail? The question is, how did women become strong enough to live beyond their ovarian function? Right? You're asking that question from a position of strength as opposed to assuming a position of weakness. Answer lies apparently with grandmothers. So if you compare us to chimps, which are our closest living ancestors, and there's a whole chapter on this in the book, chimps have very similar ovarian function. They have oocytes that ovulate in very similar ways. They have a winding down of their ovarian function like we do, except chimps die. Most mammals, in fact, reproduce right up to their end of the lifespan, and then they die, and humans don't. So if you look at a human pregnancy, it is far harder than a chimp pregnancy, or, a hippo pregnancy, or, any other pregnancy. We have higher maternal mortality historically. We have an incredible amount of blood loss. We also have these heavy periods that are required to have the pregnancy that we have. So there's even more biological toll before you get there. So there's much more investment. In addition, we have a very kludgy reproduction in the fact that we walk upright, and walk upright gives us a small pelvis, but we also are very intelligent and we have big heads. And how do you get a big head through a small pelvis? You get a big head through a small pelvis by saying that the person delivering the baby is going to suck up the reproductive carnage. And so it's hard on a female body to deliver. It's hard on a body that delivers pregnancies. In addition, you now have an infant that is very neurologically vulnerable. Human infants can't feed themselves. They can't crawl on the back like a chimp and hold on. They are very, very dependent. And so think about it evolutionary tens of, thousands of years ago. How do you care for this incredibly weak infant or this immature infant? You're weak yourself from just giving birth. And what if you have, a surviving 2-year-old that you also need to look after? Who can help you? Well, the person who can help you is a grandmother. A grandmother can offload those tasks. And there's data that shows that when a grandmother lived close by, so historical data from the 1700s, that her children were more likely to have grandchildren. And when her children moved away, there was fewer grandchildren. And for each decade a grandmother lived, there were 2 more grandchildren. So the grandmother hypothesis is this concept that there would be some women who lived a few years beyond their ovarian function. And as they did, they would provide more support for their family, ensuring that there was more grandchildren who would then they would be able to have those genetics passed down for longevity. And, that's the grandmother hypothesis. And studies that have looked at the Hadza women, Hadza were a tribe in Tanzania that up until the 1980s had really, resisted encroachment from industrialized societies, that looking at this is fantastic works done by Dr. Kristen Hawkes, that looking at the Hadza women, that when their daughters were breastfeeding, that the Hadza women's foraging went up, and they were foraging up to 37 hours a week for food, really providing the bulk of the calories for the family. And so a lot of people say, well, how's that true? What about all the men were all out big game hunting, and how could grandmothers be providing calories? Well, big game hunting is actually a really terrible way to provide calories because it's not successful most of the time. And only 3% of the family calories actually come from big game hunting. What big game hunting probably did was solidify your social status, because the game would be shared with the collective. So you weren't doing big game hunting to feed your family. You were doing big game hunting to improve your social standing and feed other people. And so that really sort of, makes us look at these family units in a different way. And so we have other support for the grandmother hypothesis with killer whales, hence the picture of the orca there. So toothed whales are the only other mammal that have menopause. And they wouldn't really be called menopause because they don't have menstruation. They have estrous cycles, but we'll call it menopause because we got to call it something. And in pods where there's a grandmother and they've followed these grandmother daughter grand calf dynamics, that when there's a grandmother that survives, there are more grand calves, and the grand calves are more likely to live. And that the grandmothers may even share their food with the grand calves and be able to source food in times that were scarce. And this is probably the same for our ancestral grandmothers, that they would have the history of their own mother foraging or their own grandmother and be able to pass that down, how to look for food when times are scarce. One interesting fact about killer whales is male killer whales all die around the age of 50. It's only the females that keep on living. So interesting. So, when you tell this story this way, menopause isn't about failure. Menopause isn't about being weak. Menopause isn't about ovarian failure. Menopause is about thriving beyond your ovarian function to add to the collective. It's evolution, the long game. And now, obviously, today, there's lots of grandmothers who aren't very helpful. And certainly my own mother would not have been a very helpful addition to the family unit. But it just makes you think about menopause a different way. It makes you think about a sign of strength. It makes you think that we shouldn't be looking at a woman in her 50s, 60s, or 70s, or 80s as being in her dotage or frail. We should look at her as being able to be a vital contributing member to society. So I just want to talk a little bit briefly about the Women's Health Initiative, which was a large study that sort of threw a kink in menopausal hormone therapy. And many people here probably heard the term hormone replacement therapy. Well, we've really tried to abandon that. We talked a lot about the language of menopause and how that really matters. Well, hormone replacement therapy implies that you're replacing something that should be there. And nobody who's 55 is supposed to have estrogen. It's supposed to be gone. It's a therapy replacement. It's not like your thyroid. If your thyroid gland's not working, you need thyroid hormone. So that's replacement therapy. And it's a slightly different terminology, but it makes you look at it differently. It means that hormones are a therapy and they should be looked at as a therapy. It doesn't mean that they're good or bad. It just means that they're a therapy. They're not a replacement. So the Women's Health Initiative was a large prospective study that was supposed to sort of be the nail in the coffin to show that what was called hormone replacement therapy at the time, which we now called MHT, was going to prove that it improved longevity, that it reduced the risk of cardiovascular disease, and was something that all women should be on. And unfortunately, when it came out, it was halted because of an increased risk of cardiac disease that was unexpected, and also an increased risk of breast cancer. There were many problems with the study and how the study was communicated, and problems with the study. So, for example, the age of enrollees was much older than what we usually start. So if the average age of someone is 62, that's not the same as starting hormones when you're 48, because your risk of cardiovascular disease is already higher. The Women's Health Initiative was really important because up until then, most of the studies on menopausal hormone therapy were observational studies. They weren't randomized. And so, if you are looking at people who have access to menopausal hormone therapy, they're more likely to be in a higher socioeconomic status, and that's associated with better health in menopause. So to truly hormones are the deal, you need a randomized, double-blinded, placebo-controlled study. Now, the fear of breast cancer that came from the WHI was a little bit overblown. They said they wanted the results to have a bang, and they certainly did. But the small increased risk of breast cancer that the WHI found was already known. We already knew there was a small increased risk. What we were hoping to see was offset by other things. Now, one of the big issues with the WHI is when it was halted, it created this vacuum. So it took a little while for professional societies to scramble to make heads of this data and come up with guidelines. In addition, there weren't a lot of other therapies that were out there for hot flushes. So on this timeline, you can see that, the first studies looking at other medications for hot flushes like gabapentin or venlafaxine, they only came years before. These therapies were not mainstream. And so what happened is these so-called bioidentical, which is a marketing term, it's not a real medical term, hormones and compounded hormones, they stepped into that gap that was created. And the real issues with those hormones, and there's a whole chapter on it in the book explaining why they are not what they claim, and compounded hormones are not as safe as the traditional pharmaceutical ones that we have, and many of them are actually quite risky. And these kind of related along until 2009, when Suzanne Summers and Dr. Christiane Northrup appeared on Oprah promoting bioidentical hormones. And you can only guess what happened then, that there was an explosion. Oh, I'm going backward. And this is a Google search, and you can see that 2009, and the search term is bioidentical hormones, and obviously it was everywhere. And, this is concerning because, Dr. Christiane Northrup was known to me as someone who you should not listen to for health advice. But you might have heard her name recently in the pandemic, because she is one of there was a recent report on I think it was the top 10 or the top 12 spreaders of misinformation about the COVID vaccine and about COVID in general and masks. And she's one of them. She was anti-vaccine when she was on Oprah. She actually kicked off Instagram because of her QAnon and anti-vaccine theories. She's full on QAnon. I guess she thinks Democrats eat babies. I mean, really, this is a woman who she has an updated version of her menopause book coming out. And she's also a huge spreader of the lie about COVID vaccines causing. And she's the one who sort of seemed to come up or perpetuate or really promote or gestate, whatever word you want to use, the lie that vaccines can somehow be shed affect other people. So that's Dr. Christiane Northrup, and she's sort of the mother of bioidentical hormones. There's a couple of other big players too. A doctor called Dr. Lee from the 1980s, who was a family physician who has done zero research on menopause hormone therapy, but nevertheless had these fever dreams basically about progesterone. And so there's a few of these players from the 1980s that had these, what I can only describe as bizarre ideas about hormones. They were really kind of festering along fringes. And when the WHI sort of created that gap, they really exploded. And now we have this massive industry of so-called bioidentical compounded hormones, and they're about 40% of the prescriptions. And many, many, many people are being exposed to actually really harmful therapies, and the doses are very high or they're too low. They're given in ways that haven't been studied for absorption, and yet women believe that they're getting something that's better. And it's really a shame. And there was a report last year from the National Academy of, I think it's Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine. I can't remember the full name of it. And these are difficult to compound medications. These are not easy to compound. They're huge issues. They identified all of these problems and made recommendations, but nothing has happened. So it's those things are really buyer beware. So that's the problem. When people ask Dr. Google, what happens is they end up with on these sites where people are promoting the the therapies that are dangerous or scammy treatments, it's very hard for people to find quality information, as these providers who are doing the compounded therapies or recommending other sort of scammy treatments are incredibly savvy about search engine optimization. And so accurate information about some of this information isn't found until you're like on the third or fourth or fifth page of your Google search. And that may as well be in Siberia, right? Like it may as well not exist if it's not above the fold. So that's concerning. What happens is most people, when they search, they start with a search engine. That's a picture of my kids when they were younger. And 13% will start with a site that specializes in health information. So people aren't starting in places can get quality information. They're starting with places where they're victimized by search engine optimization. And where do they end up? They end up on sites that may not always be accurate. Although a lot of the Wikipedia pages on hormones actually are pretty accurate. I mean, they're not actually bad. But health magazines, WebMD, places that really don't quality information. And a lot of them now are ending on web pages from, physicians that scammy products or influencers, right? The rise of medical influencers has had a huge impact. And these gaps, I spent all this time talking about all these gaps in menopause and communication. So who do you think stepped in to fill those gaps? Companies selling scammy supplements and scammy products. So this is a problem because the internet is an amazing library. It is an amazing, but if people don't know how to use it, how are they going to get accurate information about menopause, right? Or about masks or about the COVID vaccine or about anything. So one of the problems really, which we've really seen with the pandemic and we, see definitely on Instagram is, there's these information silos that are created on social media. Positive comments get reinforced again. And so the original post gets promoted. When you have 100 physicians doing a scammy hormone treatment like testosterone pellets, which are very dangerous, most of sign up to be prescribers through a specific company, and they all end up with these websites, and they're websites for legitimate medical practices. So Google looks at these sites and says, oh, that's valid information. So when you Google, for example, testosterone pellets or testosterone therapy in menopause, all of these sites that are valid sites come up. It's just they're valid sites with bad information. And so the misinformation can be repeated countless times on sites, on social media posts that reinforce it. And the confidence of the influencers who promote this is taken as expertise. And the emotion that's behind it with the influencers creates sort of a truthiness, right? It's, if you go back to Stephen Colbert's, really original, I think, episode of, the Colbert Report, that he was going to feel the news at you. And that's really what we see with a lot of these influencers and these kinds of posts. And then, of course, people read things and they don't read them and they share it. And so with menopause, the misinformation that we see online is about these bioidentical and this fear of synthetic, even though all hormones that are used, even if they're compounded in a lab, the raw powder, with the exception of Premarin, which is the only natural hormone, it comes from horse urine directly, they're all made by semi-synthesis in a lab from the same compound. So it's a total marketing scam. There's scammy hormone levels. Just like you don't need hormone levels to see if you're going through puberty, if you're at the right age, you don't need hormone levels to see if you're going through menopause, if you're at the right age. There's false claims about hormone manufacturing and the safety of so-called bioidenticals. There's lies about breast cancer screening. The results of the Women's Health Initiative are misrepresented. There's incorrect information about balancing hormones that goes on and on and on. My friend, Gwyneth Paltrow is in on it. These kinds of scammy supplements that, $75 a month with subscription, $90 a month if you just want to buy it. Like, these supplements don't contain anything that you actually need, with the exception of some calcium. If your diet's deficient in calcium, if it's not deficient, you don't want to take extra. You don't want to get kidney stones. And so with menopause, we sort of have this overlap of the gaps created by the Women's Health Initiative, the sort of predatory aspect of wellness, and, this behemoth of social media, and, the fact that women are desperate to hear menopause. And if it's being talked about on social media, that's where they're going to go. And who would blame them? And then, wellness is really capitalizing on the gaps. It's, taking over, basically wellness is, the old patent medicines just, reworked. And then these are the kind of answers. This is Kim Anami. She'll tell you that you don't need to get a pap smear, that your body will know if your cells are abnormal. Many women are afraid of getting pap smears. They've had bad experiences. It's been painful for them, and that's awful, and it shouldn't be like that. But here you have this woman with over 100,000 Instagram followers telling you that your body will know if you have abnormal cervical cells. Well, then why does anybody have cancer? Like, why did we even invent pap smears to begin with? And with so many of these influencers, they're just sort of, they're making claims over and over again without, like, there's no follow through with like the second thought. It's very Trumpian in a lot of ways. And then, if you look at the hashtag for bioidentical hormones, I mean, it's just on Instagram, it's the misinformation is just rife. And we see a lot of overlap in this area with supplements, with conspiracy theories, which is, brings us right back to our friend Christiane Northrup. It fits right in. It's fascinating to me that people who believe in conspiracy theories are more likely to buy supplements. Supplements aren't regulated. You don't even know what's in them. With, for example, black cohosh, which is a supplement that's often promoted for menopausal symptoms. And it's a real classic one to talk about because, people who promote it say, oh, well, it was used by Native Americans for menopause. Well, it wasn't actually used by Native Americans for menopause. But, if you can tie another culture to it, it gives a mystery to it, right? So we see that a lot with supplements. It has been studied and hasn't been shown to be effective. It's associated with liver failure. And here's the kicker. Someone looked at black cohosh and found that 25% of samples sold in America, which is where it's from, it's actually an American root. It's actually a plant from here, a native plant from here. 25% of samples don't contain any black cohosh. None. And so the investigators that looked at it were like, well, I wonder what it contains, right? So maybe they were trying to give them the benefit of the doubt. Maybe when you're collecting roots, you were picking up a plant nearby by accident, right? Okay, well, that would be bad harvesting techniques, but doesn't show subterfuge. Well, those 25% that didn't contain any black cohosh, they had a plant species that wasn't found in North America. So it looks like it was purposely adulterated with something else. 25%. Could you imagine if every time you bought a carton of milk and opened it, it was orange juice? Or not every time, 25% of the time. 1 in 4 times you bought milk, it was orange juice. That would be on the national news. People would be talking about it. Nobody would accept it. The milk company would be shut down. People would be outraged. But if it's supplements, that's okay, whatever. And it's really important that people understand it's truly buyer beware. And again, when you have a lot of women who are vulnerable because they don't have information, they're going to be more vulnerable to that. And so there's a whole chapter on supplements and so metaceuticals in the book so people can understand the history of them and what's been studied and what hasn't. The North American Menopause Society is a place that I recommend people go online for quality information about menopause. So what can you do? Let's end up with some internet hygiene and the Menopause Manifesto, which is sort of your reference guide to check your internet hygiene. So my first rule is if you're selling product, it's biased. You can't get information from. So you can't provide unbiased information and sell product at the same time. And what I say to people is, wow, would you get information about depression from the people selling antidepressants, from the pharmaceutical companies? No. People would say, no, I wouldn't get it from my psychiatrist or my psychologist or my family practitioner or from maybe the Centers for Disease Control, the National Library of Medicine. I'm not going to get it from the drug company. They want me to buy their drug. So if someone is selling a supplement, you can't use them for information. So that would mean like the whole site, like Goop, absolutely unreliable because Goop exists to move product. Rule number, don't read the comments. If you're reading, so what I tell my patients is if you read a really good article on a subject, on menopause, don't read the comments if they exist. So people have studied this. There was a study that looked at people who read a fake post about nanotechnology, and then they were asked questions about what they read to see if they, understood it and trusted the author. And they did that, and some people had comments to read as well. And if they were rude or uncivil comments, it actually affected what people took away. So if you read a negative comment about an article, it means you're to not trust what you read. So, I have a Substack now called The Vigenda, And it's to also help put more information out there. And that's one of the reasons why, you have to be a paid subscriber to comment, because I figured that would limit the trashy comments that I get from people saying, oh, well, you're so mean for saying supplements are bad, or, well, I'm not saying supplements are bad. I'm saying they should be studied, but so I've taken away that so people can actually get the information in a much better fashion, because I figured people are far less likely to pay to hate comment. And I've been right. I haven't had any sort of negative comments. So that's pretty amazing, actually. And some of the posts have been viewed a lot, like 100,000, 120,000 times, and still no negative comments. So how do you search? So teach people how to search, learn how to search on the internet. So if you just put in hormones and hot flushes, the first thing that comes up is the National Library of Medicine, and that's pretty good. Most people don't use that. Most people are going to end up looking at the search terms. And if you look at the search terms here, looking at, there's Mayo Clinic, there's a few other things, but, there's, some of the sites that come up, they actually aren't that good. And actually the fourth one, if I point at the screen, you're not going to see me pointing. The fourth one on the left says hot flashes and night sweats, women in balance. Ooh, that sounds kind of interesting. I want to be in balance. So you would go check that site. And on that site, womeninbalance.org, what you're going to find is some information about reducing stress and eating a lot of green vegetables. Okay, that's okay. Avoid processed foods. Well, that's actually incorrect. Processing foods isn't what causes the problem. Ultra processed foods are the things that are a bit more of an issue. Canned chickpeas are processed foods. Drink half your body weight in water every day. Don't do that. You'll probably get water intoxication. Recommended all kinds of herbs and vitamins that are not supported in studies. And of course, recommend over-the-counter progesterone, which is totally unsafe and useless. It's unsafe in the fact that if you're taking estrogen, it'll put you at risk for getting endometrial cancer. That are, the bioidentical hormones, which is a marketing term. So people are going to get all kinds of bad information on this site. But one of the problems is there's some good information mixed with it. So how can people tell? Look, if the site's telling you to reduce stress, everything else must be right? So this highlights really this key issue that if good information is presented along bad, how to tell. So what I say to people is you can basically hack or whatever. You can optimize your search engine terms for menopause by putting NAS after every term. That's the North American Menopause Society. And because you want their results to come up to the top. And so in fact, if you do that, then what happens is all of the things that come up about hot flushes are actually quality information, right? So now you've changed the about the search term, what you get from your search just by putting NAMS after whatever question you're asking. And you can also debunk. This is from Tim Caulfield, who I think is probably someone who has done the most information studying how to debunk false health information online. Try to avoid scientific jargon, have empathy, try to listen to people's concerns. Steer clear of conspiracy theories. Anybody who's anti-vaccine is going to give you bad information about hormones. Recommend good quality sites. So whenever I see a patient, I recommend good quality sites, North American Society, American College of OBGYN, the Society of Obstetricians of Gynecology, and the American Academy of Family Practitioners. And finally, create content, try to be out there, do your best to share. And just understand, unfortunately, sometimes there are risks. And sometimes when you're online a lot, like I am, people pick pictures of you that are inappropriate. I could care less that I was in a bathing suit, but that might not be the right picture to put with an article about the importance of being able to do abortion at all gestational ages, or, you get attacked by celebrities. So, which can bring, a little bit of attention, but I'm up for the challenge. And so I just want to end with, I'm still continuing my fight against medical misinformation in other ways. I have a new podcast with the TED Audio Collective called Body Stuff. And it's our first season is 8 episodes, all about debunking health information. The misinformation. The first one was the 8 glasses of water a day myth. And I spoke to an awesome nephrologist, and you'll learn how your kidneys work. I say kidney because I only have one. So I'm so used to saying kidney. And also we talked to a doctor who's also an investigative journalist about the forces behind why you might believe 8 glasses of water a day, because there's actually some intrigue there. And episode 2, which came out the other day, was about the myth about having a bowel movement once a day. And we talked to a gastroenterologist and a bathroom architectural historian, so you can understand some of the reasons why we actually have shame behind bowel movements. We shouldn't. There's nothing shameful about it. Everybody poops. And then my Substack, which is the Vagenda, which is just, you can find it at thevagenda.com. And so, my whole mission is you can't be empowered about your health with inaccurate information. And so I think I've been speaking for maybe just over 40 minutes. It was a bit longer than I thought, but I hope everybody is still there. Maybe hopefully you've had a beer or two by then. And let me stop sharing my screen.
Well, thank you, Jen. That was fascinating information. And I have read the book, and I am interested to ask you some questions of my own, but also, obviously, there's a lot of questions from the audience as well. So I'm going to start out by asking you what is the difference between a hot flash and a hot flush?
Well, they're the same thing. I just prefer the term hot flash. I think hot flash is it's far more than a flash. It doesn't just last for a second. They last 2 to 3 minutes. Hot flush is sort of an older term. I personally prefer the older term, which is hot bloom, which means, that's a term from the 1700s. And because it really does feel like it's blooming out of your head. It's really like that. It feels like a bloom. So yeah, I like hot flushes, but hot flashes. Some people call them power surges. As long as you know what you're talking about, you can call it whatever you want.
Great. One of our audience members asked, how do hormonal IUDs influence menopausal symptoms?
Well, so that's a great question. The only thing they influence are menstrual irregularities, and they do that in a good way. So you don't get very high levels of the hormone in your bloodstream with the IUD, and it doesn't suppress ovulation reliably. So with a hormonal IUD, you're still going to get hot flushes. You're still going to get symptoms of menopause, but likely to get the menstrual irregularities. So that's a bonus. So, you won't be bleeding all over the place. And the advantage of a hormonal IUD is, say you're 48, you've got your IUD in, and your periods are, you don't have any periods because it's controlling, but now you're getting hot flashes. If you decide that menopausal hormone therapy is for you, you can just go ahead and start the estrogen because your uterus is protected by the hormonal IUD. So you've sort of got that in, so you can kind of slide a little bit easier into your menopausal hormone therapy.
Speaking of frequency of periods, another one of the audience said that perimenopause included extra periods for her. Apparently that's common, but it's not talked about so much. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, well, so periods can be all over the place. I would say the only thing that's predictable about the menopause transition, which you're calling perimenopause, is that it's unpredictable. So the most common thing is that periods actually space out. However, for some people, the interval between periods gets shorter and they have more bleeding. And so that sounds like that's what this happened to this person. And that happens because the front part of the cycle gets shortchanged. So the development of the egg gets sped up. And so you have a shorter follicular phase, and you still have that same length of the luteal phase. And sometimes that can make people feel even worse because it's the luteal phase when people have the most symptoms, the bloating and cramping and that kind of stuff. So you spend more of your percentage-wise of your time in the luteal phase. But yeah, no, so that can absolutely be one of the things that happens.
And I'm going to read this one because I have some thoughts and I want to make sure I get the full thing on there. An anonymous attendee says, a medical provider told me that she recommended hormone replacement therapy to keep my vagina soft and moist. She said she could tell which patients took hormones and which ones didn't. She said there was only a short window to decide. Comments?
Well, wow. Anybody who'd use that verbiage is gross. I'm sorry. I just like, telling people that you can tell by looking. I don't know. I don't like that way of talking to patients. So there's a lot there to unpack, and that might be hard to unpack here. But suffice it to say that, we don't recommend menopausal hormone therapy for the vagina. We recommend localized treatment for the vagina, right? So you can use estrogen vaginally, and there's also a couple of other hormones that you can use. And so absolutely, but the systemic hormones that go all throughout your bloodstream only about 50% of the time that will help your vagina. So that's not actually, we usually don't recommend that for vaginal health. We recommend using it vaginally. Not everybody gets symptoms of vaginal dryness. Not everybody has pain with sex. And so you don't need to start it if you're not having symptoms. Now, over time, up to 80% can. And so many people will need it. But if you have someone who's not sexually active and they have no plans to be, and that is some that, that is that there are some people who aren't going to be sexually active and they're not having any symptoms, why would you start it? So, why would you want the inconvenience of it? So it's really, there isn't a short window. If you decide not to start on vaginal hormones when you're 50, and then 3 years later you change your mind and you want to, because now all of a sudden you have a partner, or you decided that you were going to start using a vibrator to use vaginally, or you have a partner who you wanted to have you wanted to have finger penetration with finger play, or something else, and you just go ahead and start it. So it's pretty uncommon for people to have long-term consequences from not using hormones for short term. Is it a possibility that if you didn't go on hormones at 50 and then you never used your vagina at all for anything sexual, and then at the age of 80, you decided that you wanted to be sexually active, is it a possibility you might have some problems? Yes, that's certainly a possibility. But, those are things to explain to people so they can make decisions. But, I often have people who didn't take hormones vaginally for 10 years because they didn't have a partner and they didn't have any symptoms, and they got started on estrogen and they're just fine. So it's really a case by case thing. And so that's why it's really hard to say, in this kind of format. So it kind of really depends, and you just explain things to people and then they can decide for them.
Thank you. I had the impression that was kind of a gross thing to say, so I'm glad that that I was correct in that. Is there a difference for people who are going through menopause if you've had kids versus not had kids?
No, it's pretty much the same. Yeah, except if you're going through menopause at the same time your kid's going through puberty, you might be like, but yeah, but no, it's no different.
What about photosensitivity? There was somebody who was saying that she seems to sunburn a little bit easier. Is that a common thing?
I haven't heard that. But skin does get drier with both age and menopause. So, if you're drier, you're more susceptible to irritants and other things. So maybe the same degree of sunburn might feel more irritating. That's a possibility.
What about how are these transition phases identified with in women whose cycles are already irregular due to polycystic ovary syndrome or something like that?
Yeah, that's a good question. So we don't have enough data really on the menopause transition for people with polycystic ovarian syndrome, and that's definitely an area of we need more research. Actually, they may have a slightly lower age of menopause, so that's something to think about, because the lower your age of menopause, the greater the risk of cardiovascular complications and dementia. So that is something to think about. So it's you have to go more on symptoms, but even then, there may be a change for them. So people who have PCOS or polycystic ovarian syndrome sometimes kind of know their pattern of irregularity. So if your pattern of irregularity changes, that's something to think about as well.
What about brain fog? I know that you had a whole chapter on talking about mental, not conditions, but effects of this. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so brain fog is one of the ones that has actually been really well studied, really well studied. And you have to remember how I started at the beginning about how we think about women. We think about women as being incompetent. We think about them as being, entering their dotage, and sort of brain fog kind of really plays into that now, or society's view. So that really colors how a lot of people think about their brain fog. They think that it's the start of dementia, and it's not. So there is data, and this is one of these situations where science has listened to women and has studied it. And it is true that there are a percentage of women, not everybody, I didn't have any brain fog, but a percentage of women who will have brain fog going through their menopause transition, meaning forgetful keys, or, some word finding issues, and they just don't feel like their brain is working as it was before. Well, in puberty, a lot of people also felt their brain wasn't working as well as before, right? And nobody said, "Oh, you've got puberty brain fog. That means that, you're definitely going to have mental health problems, right? Or you're definitely going to get dementia." So think about it from that standpoint. And when they studied it, what they found is that during the time where women were reporting brain fog, there was a temporary slowing down of the ability to take in new information. This was temporary, it went away. And when they compared women against men, women in their menopause transition with brain fog still outperformed the men on the thing. So that's something to think about too. And you have to remember, we get conditioned to blame things on menopause, right? So just today, my partner, who's a man, couldn't think of a word, and he looked at me and he said, "Is that because of my menopause?" And it's like, when you've never been conditioned to think that it's your body uniquely failing you, it's really interesting to look at it from that perspective. But brain fog definitely does exist. And if you think about all of the hormonal changes, there is an effect on your brain. And the way that I explain it to people is it's worrying to have brain fog, but it's not worrisome. Right. And so, reassurance that it's temporary. It's not a marker for dementia. If you really think your brain fog is serious, then you go in and you get tested, and you'll get a memory test, and people will say, "Oh, actually, your memory's not as bad as you thought." There, are rare cases where people have early onset dementia, and so what you want to make sure is that's not being falsely diagnosed as brain fog, right? So if you really feel that you're struggling, you get tested to see where you are. And it's temporary. But I tell people to think about menopause like a new operating system, just like being an adult was a new operating system from being a kid. And when a new operating system uploads, sometimes it's a little bit glitchy. And that's kind of what brain fog is.
Would you talk a little bit about how, if a person starts their period earlier, and are they more likely to go into menopause earlier or later, or does age of onset of period have any relation to that at all?
Sorry, no. If you start early, you just get more periods. If you start your period really late, after the age of 16, you might have menopause like 1 year later. But people are like, "What? But I thought it's related to the amount of eggs that you have." And that's only part of the equation. It's also related to the amount of eggs that are ovulated each month, overall health. Because you remember, you're born with way more eggs than you need. You're going like, you have like over 300,000 by the time you're entering puberty, right? So, so it's more than that. And so sometimes that's a hard concept for people, but I tell people to think about uh, your first period and your last period. They're completely different mechanisms. Think about a bucket. If you fill it with a hose, that's the mechanism for filling it, but emptying it, you dump it out. Totally different mechanisms. So that's why, you don't sort of judge the beginning and the end the same way. But yeah, so earlier onset doesn't have an impact on menopause.
We've had a couple of questions around stress, and specifically or particularly related to pandemic things and whatnot. How does stress affect the menopause transition, or does it?
Stress makes everything worse. Stress. So think about any condition that you have like a match, and think about stress as gasoline. And it makes everything worse. I see a lot of people with autoimmune skin conditions in my practice, and they will have been fine for years, like nothing. They're on total maintenance. Like for 10 years, they've had no symptoms. And all of a sudden they're calling because they went through a divorce or they had a death, and their skin is out of control. And it's not just that they're uncomfortable, right? You think, "Oh, well, you're stressed. Maybe you're just magnifying your symptoms." They come in to see me and their vulvas have big ulcers. Their skin condition is active. And the only thing, like, how can you've been fine for 10 years and you have go through a divorce and then boom, your skin. So the toxic stress has a huge impact on things. And, if you're stressed, yeah, your brain fog is going to be worse. And if you're stressed, you know what, your hot flashes are probably going to be more bothersome. And if you're stressed, you're not going to be sleeping well. So that's going to make things even worse. And you know what, if you're stressed, you might feel anxious. And some of the symptoms hot flushes feel like anxiety. Your heart is racing, you're hot, you're sweaty, you actually feel anxious. So that's going to magnify those symptoms. So yeah, stress is bad for everything. I wish I had a cure for it.
On a related topic, we've had some questions related to depression and other mental health issues in concert, unfortunately, with menopause. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so menopause certainly can trigger depression. And we think that, there are people who are just more vulnerable to hormonally mediated depression, right? Not everybody gets postpartum depression. Not everybody yes, which, is also, mood changes in relation to change in hormones. So some people probably have a more vulnerable, basically, platform to hormonal changes. And actually, there's some fascinating data that links it for some people with adverse childhood experiences. So, toxic stress that you experience as a child, meaning parental divorce or a parent who abuses a substance or the death of a parent or, living in poverty. People who've had, two or more adverse childhood experiences have a higher rate of having actually depression in menopause. So there's probably other factors as well, but it's just, it's something sometimes people want to understand like, well, hey, why am I having it and someone else isn't? And that might be certainly one answer, where there's obviously probably genetic reasons and other things, but absolutely for some people, depression can be triggered by menopause. For some people, menopausal hormone therapy can be helpful. And for other people, they may need, more traditional, management for their depression.
What about libido? I know that I have heard things saying that your libido just completely goes away when you're in menopause, and I hope that's not true. Can you talk about that?
Well, it's certainly not true for everybody. No, in fact, some people say their libido goes up because they're not worried about pregnancy anymore, right? And they're not worried about having irregular bleeding or soaking the bed from their period. So people can also have an increased libido. So some people do report a decrease in libido. It's not everybody. And that's a really complicated thing because hormone levels are actually not linked with libido. And everybody's like, what? But, testosterone levels, people about testosterone for libido, your testosterone levels are not linked with libido. And in fact, we talked a little bit about polycystic ovarian syndrome earlier. Women with polycystic ovarian syndrome have higher levels of testosterone, and actually, they do not have higher levels of libido. They actually, on average, are a group that have lower levels of libido and suffer more with libido issues. Libido is very complicated, and everybody needs to understand that we have been sold a lie. Desire. We've been sold this idea that women are supposed to be hot and horny all the time for the touch of a man, and does that serve? Who does that narrative serve, right? It doesn't serve me. It doesn't serve anyone. And it doesn't actually serve people who want to be caring partners of women either. So desire is complicated and it requires cultivation. And also the time you're going through menopause, if you've been with the same partner, you might have been with the same partner for 30 years. And so, you might have been spending a lot of time, raising children or doing other things, cultivating desire. And it's important that people learn to sort of tolerate the lows as well as the highs, and also to think about how much effort they're putting into their relationship and their desire, right? So it's like anything. If, the more effort you put into something, the more the outcome you get. And I want to get back to that lie we've all been sold. We've been sold that it doesn't take anything to be hot and horny, that it's just there. And that's not true. And it sometimes might be, especially at the start of a relationship when something's exciting and new, but it takes effort and time. And so there are many things that people can do to cultivate desire. There's a fantastic book, Better Sex Through Mindfulness by Dr. Lori Brotto, who is one of the world experts on the subject, reading erotica, different things for different people. Now, it's true that now if you have pain with sex related to menopause, absolutely that needs to be treated, because if it hurts, that's going to affect your libido. If you're not sleeping because of hot flashes, you know what? That's going to affect your libido. If you have depression because of menopause, that's going to affect your libido. And you know what? If you're really hot all the time, you might not want someone touching you because you're so hot, and having someone else's skin on you is awful. So there can be a lot of reasons that it can contribute. But if you go through all of those things and you still truly have low libido by the new definitions, because the old definitions were actually not correct, then there are some medications, but they don't really work that well. The placebo response rates are really quite high, but if people, have an educated, want to make an educated decision, about their body, then all the information is in the book, and they can hopefully use that information.
Thanks. I'm going to ask just one or two more questions. How genetically tied is a menopause experience between, say, a mother and a daughter, or members of the same family?
Yeah, so that actually, there's an interesting study that looked at that. And maternal age is not, I mean, it's not that accurate as a predictor. The bigger predictor is the age of menopause for your sister. And that's really fascinating. And if you think about it, you share 50% of your genetics with your mother. And if you have a sister, you share 50% of your genetics with them. So if it was truly genetic, you'd think that there would be kind of a closer association. But the closer association with your sister suggests that environment plays a huge role, because your mother grew up in a different environment from you, but you and your sister are growing up in the same environment generally, right? If there's like a 20-year gap, no, but you share more environmental similarities with your sister than you do with your mother. So environment is probably a big one, and genetics obviously plays a role too. But so that's kind of fascinating.
So I know that there are a lot of questions that I have not had time to get to, and I apologize to everyone in the audience, but I want to be respectful of Dr. Jen's time. But I'm going to finish with a question that I have been asking all of our speakers here at Science on Tap. You've already touched on this a little bit, but I'd like to ask again, why do you think it's important for people to learn about science?
Right. Well, more accurate information about how things work is always helpful, right? When you know how things work, when you understand the science behind it, you can make more educated decisions, more empowered decisions. You can't be empowered with false information, right? I always tell people, think about taking an airplane ride. If the airline lied to you about where the flight was going, how would you get where you want to go, right? You need accurate information. So, yeah. And when you learn how your body works, if we're talking about sort of biological sciences, you're much better able to navigate symptoms, navigate healthcare, and get the care that you need. And at the beginning, you said we're having one talking about crows. That's so fascinating. Crows are like super smart. I want to learn more about crows. I love crow stories.
Well, I'll tell you all about that here in just a second. So, with that, I'm going to say thank you so much for all of your information. This has been really great. I've learned a lot personally. It is relevant to me in my life. So, thank you for me personally, and also from our audience. So, I appreciate your time. And again, I'm sorry I didn't get to everybody's questions, but I hope that you enjoyed it as well. So, thank you. And I am going to share my screen. I'm going to tell you about crows. Right. So we are doing Crows 2, As the Crow Flies 2, Part 2, Corvid Intelligence, Culture, and Communication. And I'm saying it like this because many of you are aware that we have done a crow talk with Dr. Kaylee Swift a couple of times in the past, and people are crazy for crows. We have sold out so many theaters with this talk. It boggles my mind. But she is coming back, and she's going to be doing covering some of the same material, but a whole bunch of new stuff as well. So that will be on Thursday, June 24. And sales, this is going to be a ticketed event. General admission tickets will be $15. The Patreon folks that I mentioned earlier, all of you wonderful Patreon supporters, we are offering a 50% discount on your tickets through May 31st. So check your emails. There should be a link in there, or go to the Patreon page. It is patreon.com/makeyouthink. Make You Think is our nonprofit partner. And that there will be some information there. You can also, if you join us on Patreon, which we would greatly appreciate, starts at $5 a month, you can also get that discount through the 31st. So come join us for Crows. Oh, also Patreon folks will get exclusive access to the recording of that talk. So yes, we'll be talking about Crows in just about a month. And as I mentioned, here is a way for you to join us on Patreon. We are surviving barely on donations from all of you generous folks. We want to keep these events free as much as we can. Obviously, next month is going to be a ticketed event, but we really think that having science available to as many people as possible is super important. So thank you for being here today. Thank you for joining us for this talk. Go check out the book and have a great evening. Thanks.